Ukraine was not at the talks. Are you consulting with President Zelensky about his red lines?
Well, just in the last week, President Zelensky has met with the Secretary of the Treasury, the Vice President of the United States, the Secretary of State, bipartisan delegations in the U.S. Senate and House that were also in Munich. Our special envoy is there today, meeting with him. So we talked to the Ukrainians throughout this process, and we explained to them very clearly what our intentions were in terms of pursuing this. In fact, the President of the United States spoke to Zelensky right after he hung up with Putin. I was in the office for both phone calls. So to say that we haven't consulted with them is not accurate. It's not true. It's also not true that we haven't consulted with our allies in Europe. I personally spoke to the 5 foreign ministers right after my meeting with the Russians and walked them through what had happened. We talked to them before those meetings, the same 5, plus the G7, plus the EU, and all the other meetings we had in Munich. So this is just not accurate. But that was a meeting to largely determine whether they were interested or not in finding a way to end this war.
Are they interested?
We're going to find out. I mean, I tell people peace is it's an action. It's not a noun, it's a verb. It's an action. You have to actually pursue it. So at the end of the day, they're either interested or they're not. If the demands they make for ending the war are maximalist and unrealistic, then I think we have our answer. If on the other hand, there's any opportunity to pursue peace, we have to do it. And I think I really am sort of puzzled generally in diplomacy. People who are seeking to end the killing and the harming of thousands and thousands of people in war are usually celebrated for an effort to end the war. If it was just the Vatican who was involved in these talks, who would criticize it? For the President of the United States to be engaged in finding whether there's the possibility of peace should be celebrated, not condemned. But anyway, that's the kind of the world we live in right now.
Did the U.S. delegation make clear to the Russians that there are no guarantees about the retention of territory they have annexed from Ukraine?
We didn't engage in any specifics about territories, none of these, because that wasn't the purpose of that meeting. The purpose of the meeting was to determine whether there was a real interest in discussing peace or not. If there is, then a process like that can begin. And I also think it's silly to say, well, the Ukrainians are going to be cut out or the Europeans are going to be cut out. You can't find a stop to a war unless both sides and their views are represented. They both have to agree to it. Like, Russia can't agree to a ceasefire or to an end of hostilities if the Ukrainians don't agree to it. It has to be on terms acceptable to both sides. Likewise with the Europeans. The Europeans and the EU have their own set of sanctions on Russia. Even if we lifted all of our sanctions, which none of that was discussed, the Europeans would have to lift sanctions too in order for something to be possible. So they'll all have to be consulted at some point, but we're just not at that stage yet.
So what's the signal, Secretary Rubio, that the Russians are serious about peace?
Well, the signal, I can't answer whether they're serious about peace or not yet. That will have to be determined by the attitude they take moving forward. The only thing we agreed upon is that we're going to talk about peace. What they offer, what they're willing to concede to, what they're willing to consider, will determine whether they're serious about peace or not. We're just not at that stage yet.
When President Trump posts that President Zelensky is a dictator without elections, what are you thinking?
I think President Trump is very upset at President Zelensky, and in some cases, and rightfully so.